All right, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to P&P Live. My name is Beth Wong, and I'm an event coordinator at Politics and Prose. We thank you so much for joining us here tonight to celebrate CARVILLE'S cure, leprosy, stigma, and the fight for justice. At any time during the event tonight, you can click on the link in the chat. I just posted it to purchase tonight's book on
good evening, everybody.
website.
Welcome to P&P Live. My name is Beth.
So the book link is in the chat, and you can ask our author questions tonight by going into the bar at the bottom of your screen and hitting that Q&A button. Make sure to submit your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat, because that's the only way our author is going to see them tonight. On to the main event. I will waste no more time. Pam Fessler is a correspondent on NPR's National Desk, where she covers poverty, philanthropy, and voting issues. And Ailsa Chang is an award-winning journalist and host of NPR's All Things Considered and formerly Planet Money. Welcome, Pam and Ailsa.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
I'm very excited to be here. Hold on. There you are. Okay, I lost Pam's face for a split second. Well, I'm very excited to be talking to Pam. Just so people know, I've known Pam Fessler for more than a decade. I met her when I was a Kroc Fellow at NPR when I was just starting out my journalism career. Pam was one of those reporters who was like right away super nice to me. Would always say hi to me in the building. And I've just been so impressed with her career over the years because she is one of the reporters in our organization who could literally report on everything. I mean, she's reported on everything from politics to homeland security to philanthropy, poverty, hunger, now election security. She's just the kind of journalist who follows her curiosity and can throw herself completely at a brand new topic. And Pam, that's exactly what I was thinking about when I was reading this book, CARVILLE'S Cure, because I had no idea that, at that time that you had any interest or expertise in the history of how we handled leprosy in this country. And you went off, disappeared for a year, and came out with this fascinating book. I had never heard of CARVILLE until I read this book. I had never even known that the US had a leprosarium devoted to trying to treat and cure leprosy for more than a century. And so I am so glad that you wrote this book because you taught me a lot. And I guess I just want to start there, like how you stumbled on this story. You learned about a family connection to the story of CARVILLE. Can you just take me back to that moment when you first discovered what CARVILLE was and how it was connected to your husband's family?
That's right. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ailsa. I really appreciate it. And thank you everybody else who's signed in. I know there are a lot of friends and family here, so I really appreciate it. And you know how much this means to me. 20 years ago, I had never heard of CARVILLE, and I had no idea what the history of leprosy was in the United States. In fact, I didn't even really understand, like a lot of people, that it still existed. And so what happened is one day, my father-in-law, who was 78 years old at the time, calls us up at home. It was like the middle of the week. And he said, I have something I need to tell you. I've been keeping something a secret for more than 60 years. And he said when he was a teenager in New York, one day he went to school and he came home and his father was gone. And the public health service had come and taken him away. And they took him away because he had leprosy. And my father-in-law never saw or spoke to his father again, and wasn't even actually sure where he had gone or been taken. He knew he had leprosy, and he also knew that he died 3 years later. But his mother, my father-in-law's mother, said, "You never should tell anybody about this disease, that your father had this disease, because it will ruin the family, because the stigma of leprosy was so great." And so he had actually kept this a secret for more than 60 years. And now as an older man, it was just burdening him and he needed to get it off his chest. So we were like, oh my goodness, what is this? So we started investigating, and my sister-in-law was able to track down where his father had gone. And we found that there was this place in Carville, Louisiana, where the US federal government had run a leprosarium for most of the decade. We took my father-in-law down there to visit. And at the time, it had been pretty much shut down, except there were still some patients there, most of whom at the time were elderly. And they were still there because they had spent most of their lives at this leprosarium, and they really had nowhere else to go. They'd lost their families, they didn't have livelihoods, and now they were being taken care of the government, by the government. And I just discovered that when the more I looked into it, that not only did my father-in-law Harold have this secret and this family that had been torn apart, but that there were hundreds of stories just like that.
But I'm so curious, like how your journalist brain works. Like when you first heard your father-in-law tell you this, what sort of motivated you to think, you know, to go beyond just like figuring out more about the family story and to just dive into the story of Carville itself? Like, how did that process unfold? When did you decide, I want to write a book about this?
Right, because I started looking into the history of it. And as I say, I saw that there were all these families and stories about other families that had been torn apart. And this seemed such a, you know, a secret, almost a secret in American history. Like, why did we do this? And one of the first things I learned is that leprosy is one of the least contagious diseases there is on the planet.
That surprised me,
right?
Because
right.
I mean,
right.
Because the way we even use the word leper in our daily language, and it means someone who is ostracized, someone who is untouchable. Someone who is totally excluded from participating in society. It's literally become a word that means so much more than the disease.
Exactly. And that's what happened. And that's even what led to the creation of Carville in the first place, back in the turn of the century, because people who had the disease, there was all this stigma related to it, and all these myths about how contagious it was and how dangerous it was. And it was combined with the whole, at the turn of the century, there was so much concern about immigrants coming into the country that they were bringing diseases that were threatening to people who lived here. And so all that, and it was also around the time at the turn of the century where people were recognizing that germs were something that caused diseases, was something we didn't really know before that. And so all this combined into this feeling, oh my goodness, we have these people who are walking around the streets of our cities with this disease, and you know, we need to do something about it. And
I had no idea that Asian immigrants were associated with this disease, like disproportionately. I didn't even know that there was a connection between the stigma of leprosy and Asian immigrants.
Right, which is one of the most fascinating parts, because actually there were not very many, the Carville, if we can just go back a little bit, what became the federal leprosarium had started as what was called the Louisiana Leper Home. And they did actually have quite a few incidences of the disease in Louisiana. And they were the first place that decided to do something to seclude patients and to hopefully, they were trying to hopefully treat them and get them better, but also to keep them away from other other residents. So at the time, most of those people who had the disease were native-born Americans. But it was used because there were a lot of Chinese immigrants coming into the country. This fear of leprosy, this unfounded fear of leprosy, was used to stigmatize, and it was actually weaponized to use against Chinese immigrants. In the book, I talk a little bit about, there's a Irish labor leader named Dennis Carney, and he kept talking about almond-eyed lepers were coming into the country, and they were going to affect the nation, and they were going to steal your jobs. And actually, at one point, this is just unbelievable, he paraded a man who had leprosy, and his face was all covered with lesions, leprous lesions. And this was a Chinese immigrant, and he paraded him through the streets of San Francisco, pointing to him and saying, "Look, this is what's going to happen."
Wow.
Yeah, so it was definitely, there wasn't really a real threat, but it was used as a threat to fight against immigrants coming into the country. And that's, can I just mention one other thing? At the same time, there were a lot of people in Norway, believe it or not, who had leprosy. Leprosy was,
interesting.
yes, quite endemic in Norway in the late 1800s. And a lot of those immigrants were coming to the United States and settling up in the upper Midwest. But for some reason, that leprosy didn't really matter.
Huh, I wonder why.
Yeah, right. That one was okay. It was people who had what they called Asian or Oriental leprosy. That was bad. I mean, we're talking about the exact same disease, but.
So fascinating. And that's what I want to get into, because your book, though it educates people a lot about the disease itself and how this disease can ravage a person, not so much because of the actual symptoms, but what your book actually goes far more deeply into is because of the intense stigma that is attached to this disease. That ravages a person's life even more than the disease itself. And I guess, I just want to start with the question, when it comes to the stigma of leprosy, why do you think there has been such an intense, almost irreversible stigma attached to this disease in a way that we don't see with, say, other diseases that had affected a lot of people in the late 1800s, early 1900s, diseases like tuberculosis or cholera? Why did leprosy carry such a unique stigma?
Right, one's the other diseases which were much more dangerous.
Yes.
Yeah. So part of, I think a lot of it goes back to the Bible. You know, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, what was called leprosy, even though now we don't think that disease that was described in the Bible actually is the same as the disease that we know today as leprosy, but other skin ailments. But it was seen as a sign of sin. It was seen as you had committed some kind of offense against God, and God was punishing you with this disease. And that's one of the reasons that you were cast out of society and cast away. And that so that the people who had leprosy in this image were people who were bad people, and they had done something wrong. And then there was also at the time, and I didn't know this until I researched the book Ben-Hur came out after the Civil War. And it was the most popular book in the country after the Bible. And in that, Ben-Hur's mother and daughter get leprosy, and they are cast out of Jerusalem. And it is seen as the way he describes it, with the fingers falling off and the skin dropping their face, it's just described as such an incredibly horrendous disease, when in fact, a lot of that's not true. Fingers don't fall off, you know, skin doesn't fall off. There are terrible things that can happen if it's allowed to go on for too long and untreated. But so I think it was that combination of those things, and just because it can look really awful. So and us not knowing at the time how contagious it was or wasn't. I told you before that 95% of the human race is naturally immune. Well, people didn't know that at the time. They didn't really know how contagious it was or wasn't. So as I say, all this stuff kind of combined to give it this image that really persists till today, actually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. But back then, and we're talking like the later part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, when someone was diagnosed with leprosy, what this book lays out in a way I never knew before is that person would instantly lose an array of rights and privileges, liberties, because of the diagnosis. Can you talk about how a Hansen's disease diagnosis, Hansen's disease is another phrase for leprosy, how a Hansen's disease diagnosis in the early part of the 20th century would automatically transform someone's life? What would happen to that person?
Well, once the federal government, so initially it was the Louisiana Leper Home, the federal government took over and made it a national leprosarium in 1920. So once that happened, if you were diagnosed with Hansen's disease, or which is the other word for leprosy, in almost every state in the country, except one, which I'll tell you about, you were immediately reported to public health authorities. The doctor would report you to public health authorities, and they would take you to CARVILLE. And some people went there voluntarily, but a lot of them were taken there against their will. They even have in the museum there now, like some shackles that people were taken in. So first thing you did was you lost your freedom. You lost your family. you were taken away from your family. If you had, if a woman gave birth or had a child at Carville, the baby was taken away and either put up for adoption or given to a family member to care for this the child. And the other thing that people lost was, and this was specifically because they were in Louisiana, they lost the right to vote, these patients.
That amazed me.
Right.
Why? What was the thinking behind taking away the right to vote?
Because, yeah, that amazed me too, as somebody who covers voting all the time. It was a law in the state of Louisiana that people who were basically inmates of any institution under the state care, that they did not have the right to vote. And these patients who were only sick, I mean, that's all they had done, they were just sick through no fault of their own, were considered inmates. And so they didn't have the right to vote.
Inmates, like they had committed crimes.
Right. And they were, as I say, where they're considered, all of the nomenclature of the place, at least in the early part of the 20th century, was like a prison. Now, I should say that the grounds themselves were actually beautiful and open, especially after the federal government took over. It was on the grounds of an old abandoned sugar plantation on the banks of the Mississippi River. It was 350 acres. They're beautiful live oak trees that still are there today. In many ways, it was almost like a monastery. There were long hallways where the patients could go from one facility to another, but there was a fence around the grounds, and there was a guard at the front gate, and they were not allowed to leave. And some patients did not leave for decades because they were considered like inmates. If they did, Ailsa, if they did sneak out, because there was a way to sneak out, like through the fence, because it's such a big grounds, and they were caught, they would be put in a jail inside the leprosarium.
They would be penalized.
Right.
But what was so fascinating is that there was a real community at Carville, even though it was a place where people were shut away from society and treated like, as you say, inmates. What you found were these incredible human stories about how people thrived in some ways at Carville and found their strengths, their talents, their ability to connect with others. And before we go into the individual stories, I was so curious when I was reading this collection of stories. How did you first find the people to profile that you wanted to profile, and how did you choose among the many patients who went in and out of Carville over the decades?
Well, I found them partly because some of the patients wrote memoirs. So there were memoirs that I could draw from, and very descriptive memoirs, as well as letters. There are amazing archives down at Carville today of stories. They had a patient newspaper that really chronicled day-to-day living there. The place, we haven't even talked about this yet, the place was actually staffed by the Daughters of Charity sisters. Because they couldn't find anybody else basically to go there and take care of the patients. So the Daughters of Charity were there initially when it was the Louisiana Leper Home. And then when the federal government took over, they also couldn't find anybody else to come. So they kept the sisters on. The sisters also are incredible note keepers. They kept diaries. So there was so much information, and there were so many personal stories that I could find. As you say, it was actually really hard to kind of pick and choose which are the ones that really portrayed what was going on, because as you point out, it was a terrible thing that these people were taken away from their families and isolated and lost all these rights, but it also was a haven for them to some extent. Absolutely. Because the world outside was pretty cruel to people who were diagnosed with leprosy, but inside the grounds of Carville, they were with people who understood this is not that contagious a disease. We're basically just people trying to live, and some of the patients were not that ill. They were young, they were, a lot of people in their teens, they were vibrant, they wanted to date, there was,
yes.
So they started bands, they started dances, they had plays. So there actually was this kind of clash between the tragedy of being taken away from your families, but also kind of the beauty of this community that developed. And we can talk more about what it led to.
Yeah. I mean, there were a number of people I'm curious about. You talked about dating, about romance. I mean, it's only natural that these people who lived with each other for, in some cases, decades, would grow to fall in love. I mean, right. They're humans. They want to have sex. They want to have romance. They need that connection. And you profile this lovely couple, Betty Parker and Harry Martin. Harry Martin's an alias though, right?
And so is Betty Parker.
Oh, so is Betty Parker.
Yeah, they're all aliases. And right, because a lot of the patients took aliases because their families, they were encouraged to take aliases because of the stigma, so that they wouldn't embarrass or shame their families.
Exactly. Well, tell us about Betty Parker and Harry Martin, because tell us about their love story, but then also talk about that point that you just mentioned. They had a chance to live on the outside, and they decided they would rather be at Carville after they tried that out. Carville was a safer, more comfortable place. But tell us the arc of their love story.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting. So Betty was a 19-year-old debutante in New Orleans. She lived this, had this kind of glamorous life. She just had a charmed life, I guess. She was just young and vibrant and beautiful. She had lots of friends. She had a fiance. And one day she discovered, this was, I think around 1928, she just discovered there was like some pink marks on her hand. And she went to a dermatologist who looked at it and did not tell her, but later told her parents that she had leprosy, that this was a beginning sign of leprosy, and that they immediately should take her to Carville because she had younger siblings and there was a concern. There is a relationship. A lot of siblings tend to transmit it from one person to another. So she was taken, her family took her to Carville. I mean, she was hardly sick at all. I mean, she just really had a few blemishes. And she went there. And at first she just was, oh, I can't believe that I'm stuck, because she had all these images. She was a very religious Catholic, and she had all the images from the Bible, and she expected all these people to be walking around in shrouds, But when she went there, she realized that there were other young people like her, and that they were, active and smart. I mean, there were people who were sick, but, and so she, was in the process of, hoping she was going to get better. But in the process, she met this young man, Harry Martin, and they fell in love. And he was about the same age, the same thing. They were just, starting out in life. And here they find themselves both stuck in this institution and not knowing what's going to happen to them. And they kept they thought they could get better there, because they kept, the authorities kept giving people hope, saying, if you take care of yourself, you might be out of here in 6 months. But that just didn't happen because there was no cure at the time. And at one point, Harry says, I'm going to leave. I'm going to escape because there's no future here for me. I've given up hope if I don't leave. So he says, I want you to come with me. And she was a rule follower. She didn't really want to do it. And she was really scared. And her parents called her up, and they didn't call her up. They sent her a note and they said, you're coming. We're going to come pick you up. And yeah, right. They said, just meet us outside the fence, at like whatever time, at 7 o'clock at night. We're going to flash the lights. And so her parents and Harry's parents came. They snuck out. They had something called what they called the hole in the fence, which was a place where the patients often snuck out. And they took a few things. They snuck out, and their parents were there, and they fled back to New Orleans. They then assumed their real names. But unfortunately, what happened is they were so scared. They were there for several years. They were so scared that people would find out who they were and that they had leprosy, or that they had leprosy. They were just terrorized almost by the stigma that people would find out. And then Harry started to get sicker The disease was taking over. And
So he was worried that he was getting more visibly identified.
Right, because it was affecting his skin and his limbs. And so finally he says, I need to go back. And she said, well, I'm going back with you if you're going back. And she had been reluctant to get married because they were very nervous about what would happen if they had a child, even though it's not transmitted to children. They didn't know that, and they were worried about it. And they were worried what would happen with the baby. You know, if they were in Carville and she had a baby, it would be taken away from them. Her parents said, we will take care of any child you had. So they got married, but then they returned to Carville. As you mentioned, years later, then as they started getting more medication and treatment so that people were starting to get better, they did leave. In the late 1940s, I think. And they went out and tried to have a world for themselves, you know, life for themselves outside, but they were always burdened by this fear that people would find out and would ostracize them. And ultimately, as older people, they came back and stayed there until Harry died. And when we brought my father-in-law down there, Betty Martin was still there. She was in a wheelchair in the hallway.
Wow.
And she's one of those people who had written a memoir that I had read, and I was starstruck. I was like, oh my goodness, it's Betty Martin. She kind of looked at me like I was a nut. But you know, it had that hold on people. The Martins always felt better and more comfortable inside Carville than they did outside.
Thank God that Betty Parker's parents sounded so loving and supportive and willing to come up with these escape plans, and we'll take care of a baby if you guys have a baby. But in the end, both Harry and Betty believed that life was better inside the walls of Carville. There was...
I'm going to just say real quick, and that's interesting because, you know, the people who were patients there was kind of a divide. There were some people whose families were, in fact, very supportive of them. But there were others who completely disowned their family member who ended up in Carville. They never saw them again. They never spoke to them. They made believe they were dead, basically.
It's so horribly sad. Well, there was another gentleman that you profiled who also found a new sense of purpose at Carville. His name's Stanley Stein. Was that an alias?
Yes, it was.
He ends up becoming the resident journalist at Carville and kind of inspired other patients to advocate for their rights. Tell us about Stanley.
Right. So his name was Sidney Levinson, and he was actually a pharmacist in Texas when he discovered that he had leprosy. And he ended up going to being admitted to Carville. And he was another one of these, you know, he was young, he was very smart and very enthusiastic about life. And he walks in and he finds this place where at the time, he felt like people had, the patients there had no hope. You know, he felt like they were just kind of living day to day. And he thought, I'm going to change that. And one of the interesting anecdotes, I think when he first came in, one of the sisters said to him, oh, you need to change your name. And he's like, I'm not changing my name. I'm the only, you know, grandson in a Jewish family. I'm not, you know, my name is very important. And she said, well, it's not because of you. It's because of the other people in the world who are cruel. You should change your name for that reason. She said, but change your name to one in which you are going to be proud of later on in life. And truly, he did. Stanley Stein is really one of the most incredible Americans I think I've come across in my journalistic career. He started a newspaper called The Star. It was initially for the patients. Initially, it had things like the movie schedule, what was on the menu for Sunday, but they started columns about patient life and then about questioning, why are we here? Questioning the authorities. What are we doing to try and cure this disease? And it started to take on a life of its own, and it expanded in circulation, not only within Carville, but outside Carville.
Right.
Because the American Legion at the time decided to adopt the patients as a cause, partly because a number of the patients, like my husband's grandfather, were veterans. And they saw this, well, we should stand up for these veterans and we should help them. So they adopted the patients, they adopted their cause, and they helped support the Star. And they started having circulation of the paper going all around the country. And it became a real crusading publication for the rights of leprosy patients.
Even Hollywood got involved at one point.
Oh yeah, no, right, exactly. So this is the great story. So Stanley, one of the things he loved was the theater. He had been in like amateur theater before he came to Carville down in Texas. He just loved the theater. And what he adored Tallulah Bankhead, who was a big actress at the time on Broadway. And they had a mutual friend. And one day he's at Carville and somebody says, Stanley, there's a call for you. And I would say this was late 1940s again. And he goes to pick up the phone. She goes, hello, Stanley. I can't imitate, but it's Tallulah, darling. And it was Tallulah Bankhead. And he, of course, almost keeled over. And she also adopted they struck up this wonderful, wonderful friendship. And she decided that she also would adopt the patient's cause. And so what she did, one of the things she did is she got all her Hollywood friends and all her Broadway friends to subscribe to the Star, And right. I in the archives there, I found all these letters from Stanley, dear Jimmy Durante, Tallulah tells me that you're interested in the Star. I hope you enjoy it. Please spread the word, get the word out that, Hansen's disease is not,
right.
Blah, 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 blah. Love, Stanley.
Right. Did he trade letters with Marlon Brando too at one point?
Oh, that was my big discovery. I found that in the, in the archives. It was like this. I'm going through the archives of letters. Stanley Stein had all his records. I'm going through and I'm picking, there's a handwritten letter and I take it out and I'm looking and it's from this kid at the time, 26-year-old named Marlon Brando. And he had just been on Broadway, had just opened A Streetcar Named Desire. And he heard from Tallulah Bankhead and their other mutual friend about the cause. And there's a letter that says, Dear Stanley, you might not know who I am, but I've heard all about the patients and how they're being treated down there, and I want to help. Please tell me how I can help. Yours truly, Marlon Brando. And then, of course, Stanley sends us notes saying, oh, Mr. Brando, I'm definitely familiar with your work, So
I've seen your work.
Right. I actually don't know if anything actually came of that offer for help, but Stanley was quite the operator. So he knew how to maneuver and use people to help the cause.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it was great. It was great.
Well, eventually, after more than a century, Carville closes. And you document the discovery of an antibiotic called Promin in treating Hansen's disease. Is that, I guess what I want to know is sort of what is the state of play today? How treatable is leprosy? How curable, how suppressible, and how stigmatizing do you think it still is? I mean, those are a lot of questions clumped into one, but what, if someone were diagnosed today with leprosy, how different is their fate today than someone who lived in the first half of the 20th century?
Well, I will answer that, but I'm going to first just say that discovery of the medicine was discovered at Carville. They had quite a research center there, and it was in the 1940s that they discovered this antibiotic, which sort of became the precursor of the treatment that we give people today. And today, if you are diagnosed with leprosy, and there are about 200,000 new cases every year in the world, only 200 in the United States, but 200,000 around the world. If you're diagnosed with leprosy and you get this medication, they say within maybe 48, 72 hours, you're no longer contagious at all to that other 5%, who might be susceptible. And then it doesn't take, it takes more treatment during the course of the year, but it is, quite frankly, pretty easily cured now. What the problem is that stigma still remains, especially in a lot of other countries, although it does remain in the United States as well. And so still you have these people who don't seek treatment and they wait too long for treatment. And what happens over time is that the germ begins to take over sort of control of your nervous system. So people lose feelings in their hands and their legs, and they can easily damage them in a way that people who have diabetes can also, would damage, because they're numb and they don't realize that they've just stepped on a nail or they've cut it. And so that's why you see, the people, they lose their limbs, they can go blind, it can affect some of their organs. So it can be very serious if it is not treated. But today, if you went to get treatment, it is actually very easy to cure.
Yeah, if you got access to treatment today, leprosy is not an issue. It's not a real health issue.
And again, it's not very contagious at all. Right.
Well, I'm curious about your thoughts on the present day, because the reason we're even on Zoom is because there is a global pandemic. We are living through another global health scare. And I'm just curious what you have been personally observing, Pam, similarities, differences between how the world has reacted to COVID, has tried to guard itself against COVID, some of the hysteria that you've seen around COVID, versus how the world reacted to leprosy. I mean, similarities and differences, any thoughts, any parallels?
Well, I think one of the things that has really struck me the most is the fact that at the time, the reason that we did what we did with people who had leprosy is because we didn't really know what the threat was. There was so much disinformation, and a lot of that ignorance and disinformation allowed all these prejudices, like we talked about it, the anti-immigrant prejudices, to kind of take hold, and the hysteria to take hold. And quite frankly, we are seeing that, again today. So because we do know a lot more about disease, but we don't know exactly how the coronavirus, is spread, what the impact is on the body over time, we certainly don't know, have a vaccine or how to treat it. And so because you have this lack of information, it's allowed these other forces to take hold that have kind of prey on the divides, the social divides and political divides that we already have. The mask. Should I wear a mask? Should I not wear a mask? I mean, it's amazing to see these conflicts, but it's because there was no clear direction from people at the top. And so there's definitely that parallel. I think what I'm struck is that the people with leprosy, they really were not a threat. I mean, they were very, very minor threat, yet they were taken, isolated, and confined. But we have this disease now that is, in fact, quite serious and can cause, we have, 130,000 or more people in the United States who've already died. And there are a lot of people who aren't taking steps, or taking it seriously. So it's the contrast of those things that's really, really struck me.
Fascinating. Well, before we get to, I see several questions already, and we will have about 20 minutes for questions, but just give us a sense before we turn to the audience. What does CARVILLE look like today? I know that you visited, you spent a lot of time there to report this book. Give us a visual, a mental visual.
Well, it's still, again, it's 350 acres. It's beautiful. It's along the banks of the Mississippi. It's now, the federal government turned it back to the state of Louisiana. It's now used by the Louisiana National Guard. And they use it for some training. They use it for meetings. But it still has all the beautiful old dormitories, as I say, these long hallways, breezeways that are open where the patients were able to bike or use wheelchairs. So in many ways, it's very romantic. It's got the beautiful live oak trees. I spent what was the infirmary, is now used for people to come and stay there, like little hotel rooms almost. usually for this meetings that the Louisiana National Guard have or other groups. So I stayed there when I was researching the book. And when I was there, I was the only person in this facility with 65 rooms. I was all by myself. And this is the infirmary where my husband's grandfather was admitted and treated in 1935. So I felt like I really was able to get this sense of what it was like at night and to be there. I mean, it's very quiet because as I say, it's in the middle of nowhere. There's birds everywhere during the day. And it's, as I say, it's this kind of combination of a tragic place and a beautiful haven. And I was very glad that I was able to spend some time there.
Well, I could talk to you for another hour about this. I also would love for you to tell us what happened to the remains of your husband's grandfather.
It's my husband's grandfather.
Grandfather.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, you could go ahead and just say that really now. It's a beautiful sort of.
Right. Then we can get to the questions.
Yeah.
So what happened is my husband's grandfather died at Carville. He was actually buried in a little Jewish cemetery in Baton Rouge. So when we went down with my father-in-law, we went and we visited the grave where it was the first time he knew where his father had ended up. And so over the years, I've been doing a lot of reporting in Louisiana, and I would always just go visit, like I'd sneak and go visit. So at one point I noticed it was way in the corner, sort of like the pauper's corner, of something of the cemetery. And it was getting all overgrown. And then at some point, it turned out, it looked like somebody was actually living there, a homeless person. And there were like old soda cans and sleeping bags. And so my husband, Matt, said, he was a veteran. Let's just see if we can move him to Arlington Cemetery. And it's a very long story. I won't go into it. It took Matt a year, but we were able to exhume his remains, and he was cremated, and we had a burial at Arlington Cemetery about a year later. And it was really quite something, because it was like the country was finally recognizing that this man, who we believe got the illness while he was a soldier fighting in the Spanish-American War, was kind of being paid back for it.
Finally, a fitting resting place.
Right.
Well, that is a beautiful epilogue to that personal story. And I want to make sure that we get to some of these questions. I'm just going to start with, it looks like Bill Black. Could you talk about the scientific debate that took place about treating this? Oh, Bill, I feel like we covered this question, comparing it to how we're treating COVID-19 today. I'm going to go to Kim Brace's questions here. One of Hawaii's 5 counties is actually a leprosy colony. Why were people shipped to Louisiana compared to Hawaii?
So the island of Molokai in Hawaii did have a leper colony or leprosy colony. That was started in the mid 1800s, before Hawaii was part of the United States. And by the time Hawaii became part of the United States, they were closing down that leprosy colony. But it was seen as a, almost a model for what Carville became. The difference is Carville was run by the the US government. It's a public health facility. So people who are residents of the United States were sent to Carville. So the leprosy colony in Molokai was separate. That was run by what was at the time the Hawaiian government.
This is from Pamela Melby. What was the most challenging part of your research? Was there information that was difficult to find?
Yeah, that's a great question, Pamela. Hi. She's a good friend. I actually don't think I had too much trouble. I'll tell you what the hardest part was. I almost had a gold mine of information. I almost had too much information because there were such good records kept. One of the interesting things for me as a journalist was when I went back and looked at the old newspaper articles that covered this time period, especially like the late 1800s and the early 1900s. I was astounded at how contradictory all the newspaper articles were, and how many I knew were absolutely false. You know, I could tell from other evidence that they were just 100% wrong. So it was kind of a challenge for me to try and figure out, okay, what is fact and what isn't fact. And sometimes I just had to kind of opt for my gut, you know, what I thought. The other thing that was, I guess, difficult for me as a journalist was I realized how much hysteria there was in the newspaper coverage of this disease at the turn of the century, which only fed, you know, the public hysteria.
Right, right. This is from Patrick Fazzari. Can you comment on Damien of Molokai?
Okay, so that's interesting. So Father Damien was a priest who did go to this leper colony in Hawaii, and he lived there for quite a while, but he actually contracted leprosy while he was there, and he died. He is one of the few, throughout Carville's history, 100-year history, nobody who ever worked there ever contracted the disease. But Father Damien, I think it was, he died around 1878 or somewhere around there. So when he went to Molokai, he worked with the leprosy patients, he contracted leprosy, and he died. And it was an international story. I mean, he got all this acclaim because it was considered that he was a martyr. You know, he was going to help the poor lepers, but he gave his life for it. And it was his death that added to this belief that leprosy was highly contagious. So you had his death, you had, you know, the whole germ theory thing coming, you had all this, you had Ben-Hur, you had all this anti-immigration sentiment, and that all happened around the end of the 1800s. And it very much fed into this belief that we needed to do something with leprosy patients in the United States.
Just fueled the narrative.
Right, exactly.
This is from Deborah Rogers. Hi, Pam. At its peak, how many patients? Oh, you know Deborah. Okay.
Oh, yeah. all my friends are here.
Hi, Deborah. At its peak, how many patients occupied Carville?
Great question, Deborah. Well, over the life of Carville, there were probably about 5,000 patients. At the most, there usually were around 300 to 500 at a time. They had capacity for about 500, but I would say most of the times that I was checking, it was around 300, 350 patients. And one of the interesting things, we actually haven't talked about this either, is they were a cross section of Americans.
Yes.
I mean, they were rich Americans, they were poor Americans, they were highly educated. There were people who had, you know, PhDs, there were people who were farm workers who couldn't read, they were Black, they were white, they were Hispanic.
Immigrants.
Right. I mean, it was a world that did not exist anywhere else outside of Carville in the United States. Their classrooms, excuse me, in the 1930s and 40s, they had classrooms for some of the illiterate patients, but also for there were children there as well, some children. Those classrooms were integrated. The sports teams were integrated. The social activities were integrated. And this was in Southern Louisiana.
Yeah.
You know, in the Jim Crow era. And these patients, they were really bound together by the prejudice against them in the outside world because of their disease. And there was, I mean, obviously there was some kind of, you know, cliques and, you know, certain groups would wanted to live together in their dorms or eat together. But for the most part, there was a lot of mingling and integration there. It was really quite extraordinary, and they were proud. The patients were really, really proud of this. Yeah. In fact, if I can find this one thing, really, one of the men who was there, Jose Ramirez, who also wrote a book, and he was a patient there in the 60s. He described, he said that they had this softball team that actually won the league championship in the 1950s, and he said the team had 4 Mexican Americans, 3 Blacks, 1 Hawaiian, 1 Samoan, 3 Japanese Americans, and 4 whites.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and they were proud of that.
Yeah. I like that they shared so much more. They had so much more in common than they didn't, you know, and they recognized.
Right, exactly. They had to stick together. And that sticking together is really what helped them become this advocacy, you know, patient advocacy force, because they were united in their desire to try and get some dignity and get their rights back.
Peggy, I hope I don't terribly mispronounce her name, Ioniuk, Peggy Ioniuk. Her question is there a maintained museum now at Carville?
Great question, Peggy. So there is actually a lovely museum there that's also run by the federal government, and there is a curator there, Elizabeth Scheck-Snyder, who may be on this call as well, who was just wonderful. And she knows everything about Carville and has collected all of these artifacts, not only about patient life there, but you know, Stanley Stein's letters, old issues of the Star, photos, hundreds, thousands of photos that were taken for the newspaper that really capture what life was like. One of my favorite things there is that when Stanley Stein first talked to Tallulah Bankhead, a sculptress was making a bust of her at the time. And she said to Stanley, she said, I'll send you a copy of that. And he goes, you know, oh, you know, why would you send me the copy of that? He says, he was blind at the time. He said, I can't see. And she said, well, you can feel me, darling. She can.
Her excellent bone structure.
Right. Well, when it came time to send, she didn't send a copy. She sent the actual bust to her. And that is at the museum at Carville today. And it's open for, well, it's not open right now because of the pandemic, ironically, but it is generally open to the public to come and see. And I highly recommend people going to see it.
I definitely want to go see it now. This is from our colleague, Jennifer Ludden. Oh, here we go. Hi, Jennifer. As more became known about leprosy, was there debate among city or state leaders about how to treat people with it? Was there any place that sought to let them stay and create an accepting community? I guess to, you know, in conjunction or versus Carville. Was
right. Well, that's an interesting question, Jennifer. So it was actually up to the states to decide that, you know, if you had leprosy, that you needed to go to Carville, the way the law was written. And all the states did, in fact, send their patients to Carville, except New York. And New York, the doctors in New York said, you know, we don't think this is that contagious. We don't think this disease is that serious. So we're not going to send people who have leprosy to Carville. And the story about Matt's grandfather, my husband's grandfather, is he was actually living in Connecticut at the time that he was diagnosed with the disease. And the doctor said, this was actually 1922, he said, I'm going to have to report you to public health authorities, and they're going to send you down to Louisiana, and you're going to be confined for the rest of your life. He goes, unless you go to New York right away. And that night, he packed up his things. He had a wife, 3 children, and a business. He left them there. He packed up his things. He moved to New York, and he set up a business there, and they eventually joined him later. And that's where he was, where he started to get so sick that they eventually did take him away. But isn't that weird? I mean, so you were a threat, a terrible threat if you lived in Connecticut, but you were fine.
In New York.
Lived in New York, no problem.
So arbitrary.
Yeah, very arbitrary.
This is from Elizabeth Scheck-Snyder.
Yeah, the curator of the museum. Hi, Elizabeth.
Oh, yes. Hi, Pam, she says. What was the most surprising thing that you discovered in your research?
Oh, now she's going to ask.
That's probably
the toughest question. Well, I'm going to have to say it was finding the Marlon Brando letter, because Elizabeth, who knows everything about Carville, did not know about that letter. Right? And I was so proud. I even write this in my acknowledgement. I was so proud when I could find one little fact that she didn't know. The other one that I found that she didn't know, and as I say, they were very few and far between, and I owe very much to her to making this book possible, is I found in the public health records here in Washington over at NIH that they had old records about Carville. And at one point, the health authorities did not like Stanley Stein.
Why not?
His newspaper, because he was a rabble rouser. He was starting to, make trouble, because people on the outside are like, wait a minute, why are you, treating people? Why do you make them stay here? And they actually had somebody undercover go to Carville and work on the newspaper briefly.
A spy.
Yes, and report back. And I found the report. It was like a typed letter. It was not signed. It was not dated, but it was clearly somebody who was reporting back and saying, not all the patients like Stanley and support him, but he has mostly support from outside, agitators like the American Legion.
Yeah.
And maybe we should get rid of the Star. We shouldn't let the Star print all these articles, which some of them were quite controversial and challenging to the federal government. Maybe we should just make it like an in-house, publication that goes back to what was being served at the for dinner on Sunday nights. What was
right. The schedule.
Right. But the doctors who were actually at Carville, the public health doctors, and as I say, the nurses, they were actually very supportive of the patients. And the doctor who at the time was the chief medical officer, he basically said, no, just leave Stanley alone. They felt that if the patients were allowed to live lives and were allowed to have some kind of independence of freedom, that they would be more willing to get treated and to get the medication that they needed to get better. They realized that part of making this facility a success was to let the patients have a life.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah. Okay. This is from Joe Shapiro. Is that NPR's Joe Shapiro? Potentially. What was the one state that didn't send people to Carville? Oh, New York. Got that.
New York.
And why not? And did people go go to the state hospital? And what was the experience, I guess, compared to Carville? No, you have so many questions. If so, do you have a sense of the difference between Carville and the abusive state institutions where people with intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, and other disabilities ended up? So I guess mainly, do you know how the state
so as I mentioned, New York was the only state that did not send people to Carville. And there, Matt's grandfather, most I can tell, is he was just seen by a doctor. He went to a dermatologist. He was never in an institution. They didn't put anybody in institutions in New York for this disease. Now, there were some, before Carville was created, the National Leprosarium, there were some states and areas that did have what they called pest houses, where people with diseases, contagious diseases, were sent. So San Francisco did have, maybe about 10 to 12 leprosy patients in what was called the pest house at the time. But all that changed in 1921, when the federal government set up the leprosarium. All the patients who were in these different facilities around the country were all brought to Carville. There was an island off the coast of, in Buzzards Bay in Massachusetts, called Penaquis Island, where people with leprosy were also isolated before Carville was created. As soon as Carville was created, they took those people, they shipped them right down to Carville.
And I think we have time for one more question. Pam, you are popular. There is just a line of questions, but we're supposed to end in 1 minute.
Well, read my book, and you can go to info@pamfessler.com. I think you can send me an email.
I'm gonna take Jennifer Chandler's question here, which is a good question. Hi, Pam. Was there something that you wanted to include in the book, but that you couldn't?
Ooh. Oh, that's a good question. And I can't think of anything. There's a lot in this book.
there is, actually.
Honestly, I honestly can't. I was very happy that we were able, my epilogue is moving Matt's grandfather to Arlington Cemetery. And I was very, very happy that I was able to move him, that we were able to move him there, and that I was able to include the book. And I do include, and we also didn't talk about this either, some of the cases today where leprosy is used here, even here in the United States, as a weapon to target and denigrate groups of people, like the caravan coming from, Central America. There were reports, oh, they're carrying leprosy. Homeless encampments in LA. There are some people who said, oh, they're spreading leprosy, none of which is true. So it's still used today.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Pam. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. You're great.
Tremendously enjoyed reading the book. I highly recommend it to all of you who haven't yet read it. It's fascinating, and it's a really good read. Like, this is obviously written by someone who knows radio, who can, like, who knows like how to make sentences very readable, digestible. It moves so quickly, and it's fascinating. It's just chock full of really amazing human stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope you do read the book and enjoy it and learn something from it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Pam and Ailsa. This has been a really, really excellent event. I had a great time. I think everybody participating at home also had a great time. I'll remind everybody that the link to buy the book is in the chat. You'll also get an email with it later on tonight, along with the YouTube link, so you can watch the replay of this in case there's something you missed. We thank everybody for your participation, because your patronage really is what is keeping the doors open at Politics and Prose right now. Your support of your local bookstore is felt by every one of our employees and our community. So thank you so much. We hope you stay well and stay well read. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Beth.
Bye.
Great.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Great job. Bye.